My name is Ibrahima Sheikh Diong. I am United Nations Assistant Secretary General and the Director General of the African Risk Capacity Group, which is a specialized agency of the African Union, which was established in 2012 with the sole purpose of helping African government to deal and strengthen their capacities in dealing with the negative effect of climate change, but also outbreak and epidemic. So we're all about profiling risk, preparing contingency planning, and eventually work with the government to develop the response so that we can protect the most vulnerable communities that are affected by climate change.
Hmm. Ibrahima, what has been the biggest challenge in these efforts to fight climate change in Africa? What has been the biggest challenge that you guys have faced?
Yeah, but I think when it comes to the challenges, let's first start with the problem. And the problem is that today it is recognized that Africa contributes less than 4% to greenhouse gases. Unfortunately, that limited contribution does not prevent us from actually suffering from the negative effect of climate change. So we've seen the drought in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, with the impact on food security. We've seen tropical cyclone Madagascar and Mozambique, and we've seen also flood in Nigeria or Kenya recently. So I think all these disasters have two things in common: the economic losses, which is in the billions, but the other one is the human losses, and that is the people who are affected by the climate and those who rely heavily on agriculture are the most affected. So I think the challenge number one is to really help our countries to have access to early warning systems so they can actually understand the magnitude of the problem that they face before they think about the solution. I think second challenge is within government, there's a need to build the capacity on contingency planning that help government to better coordinate, because at times of crisis of climate, every second count, any delay can actually affect the life of many people. I think the last one, it is really what are some of the financial instruments that we need to put in place whereby you can respond. Now, in our particular case, which I will come back a little more later, we actually obviously promote the leveraging of the insurance market to mobilize resources to respond and protect the most vulnerable. But there are other financial instruments that can be also leveraged, contingency planning, social safety net, solidarity funding, or even in some cases providing concessional financing to government so they can respond adequately. So the point I'm trying to make today, you cannot actually deal with disaster related to climate after the fact. You need to actually anticipate and make sure that before they happen, then you can come out with a plan to adapt so that no one is left behind.
Can you summarize the key takeaways from your recent African climate roundtable, which took place in Johannesburg?
Correct. I think a couple of things. Number one, if you follow the discussion on climate finance, there's a lot of conversation about the supply side. In other words, how much money do we need to respond to the demand of developing countries? But you hear less about what I call the demand side, and that is what are the needs of the countries, whereby when funding is available, you can direct them to where is needed. And I think the purpose of the roundtable was that as Africa, looking at our own perspective, what is that's important for the rest of the world to know about where we stand on climate finance. So number one, because we believe the global climate crisis called for global solidarity, we had about 10 convening powers that we brought together, global and Africans, to make sure at least we can demonstrate to the rest of the world that we are united to help Africa address these climate issues. I think a couple of takeaways. Number one, we wanted to just agree and have a consensus in terms of what is the state of demand. So what we realized in helping Africa to adapt to climate change, for the next 6-10 years, we need about close to over $3 trillion to at least help African countries to adapt so that we can deal with the consequence of climate change. And I think that number is important because you can't push the international community to commit without knowing exactly what you need. And I think that funding need is very important. I think the second part is how do we then use different voices, global and African, to remind the rest of the international community the commitment that they made need to be honored when it comes to climate finance. And that's why many of us are excited that at COP29 in Baku, the focus is going to be climate finance. And we hope some big numbers will come out of the conversation. And in our roundtable, we just want to echo, and let's join our voices so we can convey the African voice. I think the last two things I want to say out of the long list of takeaway is the importance for Africa to mobilize domestic finances. It's not just a matter of depending on the international communities. We need to also make sure our governments are part of the solution by, or maybe a functioning institution, the African Development Bank, other regional banks can certainly be part of the solutions. And last two things that we discussed is capacity building. Now, one of the challenges for many African countries in not attracting funding sometimes, because people will not fund ideas. They fund projects that are feasible and studies and prepared. So there's a huge demand in helping African countries in building the capacity in developing and providing in developing, preparing projects, I should say, in the way that they can at least attract funding. And last thing, obviously, is today with the advancement of climate science, there's lots of technology out there that's available with regard to early warning system, but they need to be mainstream and accessible to Africa. And our roundtable really made a call to action to make sure all these tools are available to Africa so we can adapt better. And so we do actually have a huge report from the roundtable and a communique that came out, and the idea is as we march to COP29, we're going to make sure that our findings and our consensus and our recommendations are represented in a way that people can at least hear the African voices.
We've seen many meetings, many conferences, many seminars with regards to this particular issue. How do you think that that particular roundtable will impact the Africans' response to climate change?
Yeah, I think in three levels. First, you may recall the last year, there was the African Climate Summit in Nairobi. And the outcome of that summit was our political leaders lending their voice from a political perspective. So I think politically speaking, the African voice is out there. What our roundtable did as a complement to that is to look at specifically where are the needs, how do we better coordinate a response when it comes to climate change, what is the additional resources that we need to scale up our intervention, but more importantly, how do you empower existing African institutions to be part of the solutions? So it was extremely pragmatic, it was practical, and if you read the communique and more importantly, the report, you will see in each aspect, for example, climate change, we do actually have a clarity in terms of what we need from the international community. In fact, we went even beyond climate change. We looked at the nexus between climate change and outbreak and epidemic, because in some cases, flood also lead to some health issues, and it's important. So it's really, if you look at it today, and you want to actually support Africa, there are institutions like ourselves that you can collaborate with, but there's also clarity in terms of areas where we have some needs. And I think that was the purpose of the roundtable, to be extremely tangible, pragmatic, specific in terms of what we need. And that's why I see how we differentiate ourselves from other gathering.
Now to climate finance. I know there were challenges that were, specific challenges that were raised during the roundtable.
In climate finance, there's a different type of needs in climate finance. Let's start, for example, adaptation. And that is to help countries build and be resilient when it comes to climate finance, or climate impact. And I talked about earlier the need for early warning system, contingency planning, and then response to deal with the effect. In our particular case, what we do in pulling the risk of the countries going to the insurance market, the biggest challenge, obviously, is the affordability of the premium that countries have to pay to get access to our product. So our priority number one, as far as ARC is concerned, is to what I call the AAA of climate finance. It's very innovative in a way that you are basically helping government to have access to additional resources off budget so they can respond in the type of crisis. The reason why it's challenging, because most of our governments, as you know, have so many competing needs. To convince some of them to allocate resources to something that may or may not happen is always very market could be part of the solution, but you can't afford to pay your premium, we can provide you subsidies so that you can pay your premium and be able to at least access our product that we offer. So the AAA of climate finance in terms of parametric insurance is literally how do you make the funding available, accessible, but affordable to countries so they can actually be able to take up some of the product that we offer at ARC. So that's one aspect of climate finance. The second part is there's also the whole green economy that's happening in climate finance. And that is countries want to use renewables so they can mitigate impact of climate change. And that is an area that could present tremendous potential, in my view, for the private sector to really invest into some cutting edge areas of technology or innovation or energy and so on. So there, I think the suggestion that we made and say, look, the need in the area is in the trillion. So how do you use, for example, instruments like the Green Climate Fund, which was set up 9 years ago after the Paris conference on COP15, to then provide the impetus and the catalyst funding so you can attract more private sector funding and we'll be able to at least promote renewable energy or other type of energies that really contribute to mitigating climate change and so on. So I think the point I'm trying to make is the following. There are different type of needs of mitigation and adaptation in climate change. But as far as Africa is concerned, our priority number one is to make sure we spend a lot of money into adaptation, because that's where we see the direct impact it has on the people that are affected by the drought, the tropical cyclone, and the flood. And that's how we can protect the most vulnerable people in Africa.
Okay. How about the capacity building you spoke about? I mean, what initiatives were announced to support capacity building? I know that area is very huge.
Right. Yeah, the different level of capacity. Let's start, for example, with technology. In today's climate management or disasters management, one thing is extremely critical, and it is access to early warning systems. Because early warning systems basically do save lives. So you want to make sure at least our policymakers, they do make informed decisions based on data, because data allows you to understand when is your drought coming up, the flood that's coming on the way, tropical cyclone, and that is extremely critical because it allows government to make informed decisions. So I'll just give you an example. In Madagascar, when they faced 2 years ago tropical cyclone, the fact that we made the warning system available to government 5 days before it happened, it helped government to move 5,000 people from harm's way so you can save lives. So I think the need, number one, is in capacities, and make sure that that type of technologies and the infrastructure around it is made available to our countries. I think number two is in the business of adaptation, there's something we call contingency planning. There is something we call customizing your risk as a country. There is something to be done in terms of monitoring and evaluation so the countries can at least understand the impact of the intervention on the ground. So there is a whole series of areas where countries need some help. And our support, obviously, through capacity building is a way of making sure you can reduce the capacity gap. Now, I'm not saying that all the countries have the same needs. Some are more advanced than others. But let's say at ARC, what we do within our community, we help countries to work together, learn from one another's expertise so that they can make some progress. Last point of capacity building, extremely important. In the business of climate change, the world has agreed to reduce the global temperature to 1.5 degrees. So each of the countries have to contribute to get to that level. So there's something called the nationally determined contribution. Will make a commitment how much they will contribute in lowering actually the temperature. Oh. Now, when those NDCs are defined by countries, they should then be translated into projects that are fundable by the international community. Now, some countries have a lot of challenge in transitioning from that NDCs to something actually fundable. So the capacity building basically involved helping countries to put together investment plan, project, and proposal that are fundable. And that's basically the kind of capacity we're talking about.
Mm. What partnership were announced during the roundtable, and what impact are they expected to have? I'm talking about partnership. I mean, with a partnership coordination and others, I mean, that actually were announced during the roundtable.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look at, we have 10 convening powers that came together. And within those 10 convening powers, so I think the mere fact that we came together is a reflection of our desire to work together in the different issues that I mentioned earlier. So starting with our existing partnership, the idea is basically to beef up our partnership, either in the business of early warning system, in capacity building, or in mobilizing resources so we can actually scale up climate intervention across Africa. So what we've done toward the end, there are a couple of institutions that really announced what they intend to do going forward. And that is, for example, GGGI, which is the Global Climate Institute based in South Korea. They decided to basically work with ACT to do more in early warning system capacity building, for example, in Africa. Our ARC also reiterated the collaboration with Afro-Exim Bank, which is also into climate finance, particularly dealing with adaptation. We also use the opportunity to renew our commitment to working with UN Habitat to address another part of climate finance, and that is urban climate resilience, because our cities are also affected by tropical cyclone and flood. So we intend to do more in beefing up climate resilience in the cities so that we can also protect the most vulnerable in those areas. So I think overall, well, the next step will be out of those 10 convening powers to look at each of these areas. What is defining the needs, scaling up climate finance, developing some new instrument, early warning systems. For example, in early warning system, we agreed that each of us as an I can mention the early, yeah. So I think, for example, let's take the early warning system. One of the things that we agreed to follow up on is that if you look at the 10 convening powers, each of us, for example, bring different parts of the solutions. The first part of the solution of early warning system is to have access to reliable data. So in the 10 convening powers, we have WFP, we have Afro-Exim Bank, we get the African Development Bank, and so on and so forth. So we agree that it's really important that we join forces and make sure we develop a stream of reliable data when it comes to climate data. And then two, we also agree that each of us have our own way of modeling risk, and that risk modeling should be made available to our member states so they can at least understand what they're exposed to. And then third, there's a lot of access to technology that's required for some of the countries, so then the policymakers have access to reliable modeling systems and so on. So what we agreed to is to join our forces as convening powers and create a platform, an early warning system, so that you can then rely on our various tools and make sure that policymakers can make informed decision on climate decision. And I think that's, to me, a major takeaway from our conversation as well.
My last two questions. I know very well that there were recommendations. And if they were, what specific actions will be taken to implement the recommendations from the roundtable? And then how would progress be monitored and reported?
Yeah, but I think the takeaway, as I said, we are on our way to. All right, so I think the priority number one is that there was a general consensus at the roundtable that the African voice is not always heard where it should be. So the mere fact that we produce a document and a communique, it talks about the state of need, the empowering of existing African institutions, what it takes to scale up, how do we showcase our various successes and so on. To me, it's a good starting point, at least knowing what Africa wants when it comes to climate finance. So as we work toward COP29 in Baku, priority number one is to make sure that that voice, that consensus, those needs that we can develop together are represented across the different platforms and discussions, so at least the African needs are clear. I think second, we get 10 convening powers, global and Africans. We're working together. We have successes among ourselves. So what we want to do is make sure that those successes are showcased to demonstrate to the international communities what we can do with additional resources coming our way. And that's, in my view, extremely important in demonstrating success. Last but not least, we will also make sure, why not have a second edition of the Roundtable a year from now or 2 years from now. And the objective of that second edition is not just to have another discussion about a roundtable, it's just assess how much progress we made in mobilizing more resources and being more impactful on the ground. And that's basically some of the 3 steps that we have taken in following up on the roundtable.